Well, good afternoon, everybody. Kyle, to you and your colleagues, I just want to thank you for the invitation to join you here today. And I need to say this is the best organised event I think I've been to ever. If ever you get invited to do something with CEDA, I don't know if it's just like CEDA in Queensland, say yes, because it's an absolute dream. And I also just want to say this is the most fantastic public room I've ever been in. It's an absolute gem. To walk in here, it's awe-inspiring. So anyway, that's probably not what you thought I was going to talk about. But it's a really special place. So it's wonderful to be able to offer some remarks today. I want to begin by saying a few things about what I'm not really going to talk about, not in any detail anyway. For example, I don't want to make a compelling case based on justice for why there should be diversity in Australia. I think at least if one was to consider the question of gender diversity in all its aspects across Australian society, I actually think the case is unanswerable, that we don't need any longer to make that argument. But if you are still questioning it in respect of other types of diversity, then I'd invite you to consider one thought experiment which is derived from the work of John Rawls in a book called A Theory of Justice. And many of you will know this, and there are some problems with where he goes with it. But the device that Rawls brings into focus is what he calls the veil of ignorance. He says if you're going to try and imagine what kind of society you want to have, what rules ought to apply, then you've got to do it by looking through the veil of ignorance in which you cannot possibly know who you will be in the future, what the state will be into which you might be born. You won't know, for example, whether you're going to be rich or poor, old world, new world, whether or not you're going to be an Indigenous person or somebody born within a majority population, whether you'll be part of the powerful caste or those who are weak and oppressed. And if you start to think about this, if you can't possibly know who you would be in the future, then immediately, of course, you see you've got a powerful prudential interest to ensure that whatever the circumstances of your birth, there will be a basic level of equity available to you and to other people in similar circumstances. Now, it doesn't mean in Rawls' view that we'll all be treated exactly equally, but there'll be some basic minimal elements of justice that need to be put in place. Now, ideas like that are so compelling, I find it. It's such a reasonable proposition that we should have a just and equitable society in which all people are given a reasonable opportunity to use their talents, that I'm not going to spend much time beyond saying that and inviting you to apply that thought experiment on the question to do with justice and diversity. Nor am I going to spend a lot of time appealing to people on the basis of prudence and self-interest, because again I think it is unarguable that talent within our population is equally distributed across the whole community, that there is as much talent to be found amongst women as there are in men, that there's as much talent to be found with any community group, whatever its origin, as in any other. And therefore it is illicit, it's self-defeating in some senses, to deny yourself because of prejudice and institutional arrangements the opportunity to have access to that talent and make best use of it. Again, I think it's an unarguable proposition. I hope as a nation, on those two grounds at least of justice and prudence, that the debate about diversity has already been answered. So what I want to do instead is talk about something which is far more speculative on my part. I'm not going to be telling you something which I'm absolutely certain of as being right, but which I think could be an argument worth considering. And it's to do with the exercise of power in conditions of complexity and how diversity may assist us in resolving some of the really serious challenges that we face at the moment. Now, to get us underway in terms of how to understand the nature of these challenges, I want to tell you two true stories. The first of them involves a former Prime Minister of Australia. He died just a bit ago, Gough Whitlam. And he was at a gathering in the Mansion House, a building much like this actually within the City of London, where he was invited to give an address to the good and the great from the City of London, who would assemble to hear him talk about Australia's economic policy. So you've got to imagine a scene like this, but there would be gold and silver on the tables and lots of people in dinner suits, probably all men, mostly men in there at that time. And they're sitting there, and Whitlam knows that he has to deliver a relatively dry speech on economic policy. But before he does so, he wants to say a few words, make a few informal remarks about his host on the occasion, the Lord Mayor of London. The trouble was the Lord Mayor of London at that time was an arch-conservative, and of course Gough Whitlam thought of himself quite properly as a reforming Labor Prime Minister. So he's looking at a briefing sheet provided to him by a protocol officer, and he notices one distinctive fact about the Lord Mayor of London, and that is that he was formerly a distinguished oarsman. He'd rowed for his school, he'd gone on to row for his university, and he'd later rowed for Great Britain. And Whitlam stands up and he says, "Your Worship, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I came here this evening that His Worship and I have absolutely nothing in common. But now I see that we are united by one thing, because as you know, he is a distinguished oarsman and I am a politician, and the thing that unites us is that we both look one way and go the other." Now, there was some justifiable mirth, no doubt. He was a very clever man, and I actually had the privilege to sit down with him at dinner one night, and he confirmed this story. He was very proud of the way his wit had been brought to bear. But you tell that story today, and it's not so funny. It's not so funny because it reveals a deeper and more serious issue about our society today, where too often people who are in positions of power say one thing, look one way, and go the other. In fact, we've had a round of politics, we've had a round of institutional failure, which is almost invariably based on that phenomenon, where claims of commitment are simply betrayed by the actual practices that corporations and churches and parliaments and pretty much any institution you care to name actually make. And of course, we all know the devastating effect of this. Even when you're quite a small child, you know what it's like when someone you respect and admire says one thing and does something else. You experience it as hypocrisy, and when you experience that, you at least become sceptical, but worse, you possibly become cynical. And cynicism is like an acid that eats away at the bonds of any community. When people become cynical in a corporation where they say, yeah, they say that, but they do this, it begins to fragment and risk begins to increase. When it happens in response to institutions, the Catholic Church for 2,000 years says that love is more important than the law, that people are more important than property, that you should stand up and face the truth. And yet when they have their moment of truth with allegations to do with the sexual abuse of children by the clergy, what do? They go to the law rather than love. They protect their property rather than their people. They protect their backs rather than stand up for the truth. And it was that betrayal of 2,000 years of espoused commitment, as much as what was originally done, that gave rise to the terrible response and the cynicism that church and others like it, and it's not just them, have elicited across the community. So we see this happening around us and we try to find an antidote to it. And often the antidote is to try and increase the level of regulation and surveillance, to tighten the screws. If only there were enough rules, if only there were enough regulations, if only there was enough oversight of every decision made by people who are exercising power, then perhaps we may be able to control this. Well, the second story I want to tell you about is to do with some of the limitations of thinking about this. And then I'll explain why I think diversity is such an important situation to address. It's another true story. It's almost 25 years ago that it happened to me. So just a week or so ago, I celebrated my 25th anniversary working at the Ethics Centre. I'd come back from Cambridge, newly minted. I was completely green. Obviously, a much, much younger man than my continuing young self. And I was in a taxi cab heading to the airport on my way to Brisbane, which is what's triggered the memory for today. And the taxi driver was telling me his life story, as they sometimes do. You know, they get into a bit of a role, and he'd been telling me about this and that. Anyway, the thing that jumped out for me from his story was that until recently, he'd been working in the construction industry. Now, those of you who live in Queensland and look south will know that there are regular royal commissions into one form of corruption or another in New South Wales. And at around the time this fellow was telling me about his personal career, there was one of these royal commissions running, looking inside the construction industry. And he just told me that before driving taxis, he used to be a concrete truck driver. So I said, well, this is fascinating. I said, I've been reading in the newspaper about all these allegations of corruption. You've actually worked in construction. Is it true? He goes, oh, mate. No, mate, you're building a hospital for the nuns out west at St Mary's, and one of the bosses or one of his mates wants to have an extension to the house or a swimming pool put in, so word comes down, and before you know it, we divert the truckloads of concrete, and after a while, there's the extension, there's the swimming pool. I said, oh, wow. And he said, mate, he said, no, that wasn't the worst of it. Something worse was going on than that. So I'm now thinking to myself, what's worse than stealing from nuns? You know, this sounds like pretty serious stuff. Are whole buildings being relocated in the dead of night? No, he said, mate, he said, somebody stole $20 from the lockers in the workshop where I used to get changed. Wasn't going to have a bar of that. No, mate, no, got out. That's why I'm driving cabs. So there's now a sense of relative significance going on here. And so we go on a bit further. He says, mate, what do you do? And I said, I run an ethics centre. And he says, what's that? And this is actually a pretty exciting moment for me. This is my chance to talk to him about ethics, to explain what we were doing, and to have him engaged in this. And it worked fantastically. His face lit up, and as we went along, he tapped on the back of the steering wheel, saying, mate. Oh, mate. That's what we need, mate, an ethics centre, mate. And I'm feeling pretty good. I'm thinking, here we are. I'm out there in the world talking about ethics, and he's enthusiastic. And I'm feeling really pumped. And we get to the airport, and I ask for a receipt for my taxi fare. He says, yeah, mate, now, how much do you want it for? It was a really bad moment. You're actually lucky I kept going, because I don't think I showed myself to be very competent at that point. Anyway, I was wondering, how can you talk to somebody for 10 minutes about ethics, and then at the end they say, how would you like to rip off your ethics centre? And I decided not to die wondering, so I asked him, and I looked across to him and I said, look, don't you think it's a bit odd, after everything we've just been talking about, that you should say, what do I want on the receipt? And he didn't get angry. His face changed. He stopped being all happy. He just got puzzled, or maybe he was a bit blank. But he said to me, oh, mate, everybody does it. That's just the way we do things. And for me, that was a huge insight into the particular challenge that I've been looking at now unfolding over at least 20 years, 25 years. Most of the things that I've encountered in the world which have been bad things, where people have been hurt and damaged, they've not actually been done by bad people. They've been done by good people doing bad things. And when you ask people about this, how could you possibly have done that? They look back and they're shocked. But at the time they say, and they say truthfully, they say that I didn't see it. I didn't see it. Why didn't you see it? Because everybody did it. That was just the way we did things back then. Now, I wonder, you might be thinking now, even where you work, when you go back, how much of what you do can be just explained by that and nothing more. Things that you do every day, because that's just the way we do things around here. Because everybody does it. Now, it used not to matter too much if people were just following habits, even bad habits, because their capacity in the past to cause real damage was extremely limited. I do a bit of work with the Defence Forces, particularly preparing soldiers to go to war in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. So right at the pointy end, when they're having to deal with the challenges of asymmetric warfare, where your enemy is deliberately trying to provoke you to act in a way which uses force disproportionately or indiscriminately, because they want to cause a scandal. They want our forces to lose whatever moral authority they have. And they have understood this concept of what they call the strategic corporal. Now, what they have in mind, it'll be obvious to you, is a difference that exists now than, say, 150 or 200 years ago, where generals sitting on their horses on the top of a hill, people like Napoleon Bonaparte and the Duke of Wellington, they would be the ones that caused strategic effects. They'd give the orders which changed the strategic environment, not the corporal down in the mud and the blood who may be engaged in an individually heroic contest of arms. They didn't create strategic effects, but today they do. Because if a corporal burns a Quran and puts it up on the internet, or a series of junior people do what happened in Abu Ghraib, or you see prison officials, as occurred in 2014 and revealed just to all of us on Monday night, treating those young people in those juvenile detention centres in the Northern Territory. When that happens, it's the Prime Minister that's on the radio the next morning, or the President of the corporation, or anybody in seniority, because anybody today, because of rapid communications and our mobile technology, anybody can create a strategic effect. It'll be a person working in a call centre that will do something a bit dodgy and it's suddenly picked up by talkback radio, bang, it's in the boardroom. Anybody can do it. And so we're operating in a world now in which, with that degree of complexity, it becomes a real challenge as to how we manage it. Now, the traditional response has been, as I said, to increase regulation and surveillance, to apply what could be called a series of side constraints. They're the traditional models of power for constraining or controlling things. Now, if I just give you a physical analogy about the problem with this, imagine there's a whole lot of gas molecules. This is for you from ConocoPhillips. We'll use a gas analogy. Imagine there's a series of gas molecules and you want to keep them in the right place. Don't want them spreading out because of losing them, causing damage. What you do is you put them in a gas cylinder. That's what a series of side constraints are. But if you throw that cylinder on the fire, sooner or later the amount of energy you'll need to constrain them, because it becomes more complex as a system, the equations won't work and the cylinder explodes. We do exactly the same with our social systems, with our society, with our corporations, with our organisations, schools, whatever group. We actually bring together a series of side constraints, like the gas cylinder, rules and regulations, the systems of surveillance I mentioned. The problem is all of the energy needed to fund those systems have to come out of the system itself. So let's suppose today we thought, well, this is an untrustworthy mob coming to the City Hall, so we'll just protect ourselves by having a policeman stand behind every chair. Very expensive process. Because what if we can't trust the policemen who are standing behind the chair? We'll have to have another policeman standing behind the policeman. You can imagine infinite recursion. It'll be an unbearable cost. And so social systems of our kind that have been struggling at the moment are failing adequately to address their challenges because that system of power, in order to control risk in a complex environment, is unable to cope. It's just too expensive and it's ineffective. And there are all sorts of reasons I give, but I won't go into the details now. But hopefully you get the sense about why there has to be something else. And this is where diversity comes in. When people say that they don't see the things that they're doing as wrong, they are telling you the truth. And typically people don't see these things because they have learnt to see the world through a very limited spectrum. There used to be, at the enclosure in Taronga Zoo in Sydney where the tigers were kept, a small perspex screen. And if you stood in front of this bit of it, instead of being able to see in colour, as we typically can as human beings, you saw in black and white, as animals see. Most animals in the world, the vast, vast majority, can't see in colour. We're very special in our ability to do that. They just see in black and white. And the tiger would be in this pen, and you'd see it there with its vivid orange stripes moving through until you got to this point where it was just gone. You might have got a little bit of a flicker of movement because tigers are brilliantly camouflaged for a world of black and white. They just melt away. So imagine people working in an organisation where everybody has learned to see the colour green, the colours of the jungle. They can see light green and dark green, drab olive, whatever you want to imagine, but they cannot see orange. Imagine being in such a place. Well, then that's a place where you just become an easy lunch for the tiger. The tiger doesn't go away, you just don't see it. Now, the thing about diversity is that it breaks that pattern. It introduces other parts of the spectrum that allows you to see the world from an angle and in parts of the spectrum that are not otherwise available. And it is the first step to being able to bring about a change in the way in which we manage both risk and opportunity. Diversity in terms of outlook based on one's gender, one's cultural background, all of that is a vast resource which we ought to be drawing on as the better option for managing the risks that cannot be managed by these compliance systems alone. But there's a second and deeper issue, and this is directed particularly around diversity involving gender. And as I talk about this, please don't think that I'm not alive to subtle differences between actual individuals. Of course, I'm going to be speaking in general stereotypes about men and women, but I think there may be something, despite recognising general patterns and individual difference, worth thinking about in this. And it's to do, again, with this notion of power. You see, the systems of power that are based on regulation and surveillance and control, they're very much part of a world of thinking that men have grown up with, because they've controlled those things. And there's something about the history of women, because of the denial of formal access to those formal systems of power, which I think has attuned them better in most circumstances to dealing with a far more effective form of soft power, which is necessary in order to manage the kind of situations which I'm talking about. Soft power, which is about the exercise of influence, about the effective management of relationships, about the ability to create and maintain a narrative which connects people, which is about binding people together through a shared sense of purpose and values and principles, which is the antidote to the problem of the side constraints. Those complex systems I'm talking about break up like the gas cylinder thrown on the fire unless what you do is you replace these external side constraints with a set of internal ties which bind things together. Now, again, I don't want to say that all women are good at using soft power and men don't know how to do it. That's clearly not true. I don't want to suggest that a world in which women had control over it would suddenly become warm, fluffy, soft and effective. I've been to the Willoughby netball courts in Australia, in Sydney, and it's a frightening place, netball courts, in terms of the level of control that is actually exercised in these places. But I do think there's something that we undervalue about the lessons that may have actually been learned and incorporated and actually taken to a very high pitch by people who've had to adapt to a world in which they've been denied the formal instruments of power. It's not that absence has just been left nothing of value. It may be precisely that absence, which is not to justify it, because on equitable grounds it can't be justified. But if you're to rescue something from that experience, which is being changed now, it is that there are distinctive ways of exercising control and managing complexity which are better than the old systems that men have typically relied on for so much time. Now, if that is true, and I'm open to people saying, I don't believe it's true, you've missed all sorts of things, but if it was true, then it's a different kind of argument for diversity. It's an argument not based on justice, it's not based on the simple utility of being able to find more people with equal or better skills. It's about rethinking the governance of our society in a way which is better tuned to the requirements of the time. Because those factors to do with complexity and the effect of the strategic corporal, they are not going to be undone. They're going to expand. And our governance structures are going to have to adapt to do this. And I fear, because of what I'm exposed to, particularly with men of my generation and older, that they will not be able to do it because they cling too tightly to their sense of mastery over narrow parts of the spectrum. I've been into boardrooms with men who, when you tell them about some new dimension of their business, it might have been the early days of sustainability, you tell them that there's a tiger sitting there waiting to be let loose. And their response to being told the tiger is to revert to being like toddlers. They turn to the tiger and they say to it, "You can't see me." They think that by not looking at it, it will go away. That kind of governance isn't fit for the times. There needs to be something that's changed. And unless men are going to reinvent the way they see the world, and maybe that's what's going to happen too, it's not going to be fit for what we require. And that's why when you look at the recent electoral results in the federal election, you look at parliaments around and you say, is there an adequate balance for the type of governance that's needed to manage power effectively in the 21st century? So I'm going to wrap up there on that note. Again, with thanks. Just to summarise, I'm trying to hopefully prompt you to introduce another point of reflection. In the comments with Anne and with the questions, please feel free vigorously to disagree if you think there is nothing in this. I'm quite tough enough to engage in that and take the feedback. But I would ask you to think about it in this different way, about what kind of governance do we need to manage complexity, risk and the exercise of power in the 21st century, and is diversity part of the key? Thanks.